During the day, she held a scalpel and saved sick people from pain. At night, she held an IV tube and sent evil ones to hell. She had a unique view on this. For every life she saved, someone else had to die, for the good of the planet. Seok had great talent and love for medicine. She was supposed to rise to the top in a top hospital, but after an accident, she lost her license and had to do black market surgery. One rainy night, a group of men in black carried a wanted criminal out of an ambulance. They walked past a Buddhist hall and entered an abandoned building with a makeshift operating room. The nurse couldn't believe they would do a complex brain surgery here, but Seok was full of confidence. She even woke the patient during surgery and kept testing his pain to locate the problem in the brain. Thanks to her skills, Seok saved the dying gangster. However, the nurse wasn't happy with the 5 million won payment. She provoked Seok, mentioning rumors about her and Professor Choi. Seok warned her assistant, Young-ju, to choose partners carefully next time. Young-ju explained the nurse had done shady things. She used to give strange pills to sick old people in a nursing home. That's why the gang hired her for the surgery. Now, the evil nurse injected strange drugs into the gangster's IV again. She threatened Seok to give her 2 million won every month, or she'd expose her illegal practice and send her to jail. After thinking for a moment, Seok agreed. Safety always came first. The next day, the gang destroyed all the surgery evidence and moved the patient to a safe place. Dr. Han, the anesthetist, would leave with them. The nurse happily waited for her payment, not knowing she messed with the wrong person. That night, she found her water was gone. She opened Seok's bag without permission and drank the water inside. Seok sent Young-ju to deliver an important cooler to Dr. Han. After sending everyone away, the drug in the water took effect. The nurse collapsed into unconsciousness. On the way, Young-ju felt something was wrong. Just now, he had seen Seok standing in front of the Buddha, confessing. Young-ju opened the cooler and realized he had been tricked. He instantly turned the car around and rushed back. The nurse woke up dizzy, but she only cared about her missing bag with the 5 million won. Her greed for money outweighed her desire to survive. After finding the bag, the nurse counted the money with satisfaction, but she paid the price for it. After capturing her prey, Seok smiled faintly. By the time Young-ju got there, it was too late. Seok placed the 5 million won into a donation box and asked Young-ju for a shovel. The next day, while cleaning the trunk, Young-ju found hair stuck to the shovel and froze. But Seok acted like nothing happened, playing with the dogs and treating patients kindly. Young-ju said she was a total psychopath. Seok explained it was self-defense. She saved one life, then ended another, which was better for the planet. However, Seok's calm was broken by a phone call. It was from her old mentor, Professor Choi. Hearing his familiar voice, Seok remembered the past she couldn't forget. Professor Choi was a world-class brain surgeon. Seok was once his best student. But years ago, they had a fight during a surgery. Professor Choi ordered the nurses to drag Seok out of the operating room. Furious, Seok yanked out an IV tube and tried to strangle her mentor. The nurses quickly stopped her. Professor Choi felt humiliated and slapped her in front of everyone. He canceled her medical license and banned her from entering the OR again. Even when Seok knelt in the rain and begged, Professor Choi walked away without pity. Abandoned by her mentor, Seok broke down and cried hard. She could give up everything, even her life, but not the operating table she loved. Not long ago, Professor Choi was stopped by a detective just after a surgery. Detective Lee revealed that the police were catching a black market surgery broker, Min. They found a brain surgery video at one of Min's facilities. The surgery was very difficult, and only Professor Choi had succeeded in it in Korea. After the detective left, the student carefully asked if the surgeon in the video could be Seok. Professor Choi didn't answer. Instead, he contacted his friend Ms. Na and asked her to find Seok. Soon, Ms. Na brought good news. Professor Choi looked at the photo and smiled for the first time in a while. They had so much in common, even that little bit of craziness. Professor Choi went to the town and met his beloved student after 7 years. Seok still felt bitter, but she let him in. Professor Choi showed the surgery video provided by the police and praised Seok for her great progress. Seok ignored him and walked into the kitchen to cut the cake he brought. Suddenly, Professor Choi felt a splitting headache. 3 months ago, he was diagnosed with a brainstem glioma in a tough location. He needed a perfect surgery without any post-op side effects, so he could continue operating. Seok was the only one who could do it. She laughed wildly and asked if he was crazy. Professor Choi ignored her and said he'd schedule the surgery soon. Seok couldn't hold back her anger anymore and refused firmly. Professor Choi threatened her, saying the police were looking for her, so she had no choice. Then, just like 7 years ago, he walked away without pity. However, the severe headache nearly made him faint, and his painkiller accidentally fell to the ground. Seok kicked the bottle away and crushed it madly. At that moment, Professor Choi felt the despair Seok once had. Youngju appeared just in time to stop Seok and called an ambulance to take Professor Choi to the hospital. Seok lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind went back to 7 years ago. At that time, Seok was a freshman in medical school, very smart. But to others, she was a loose cannon. Professor Choi had just returned to Korea, and Seok rushed to visit him, bringing this week's neuro quiz. She then went on and on about her admiration for Professor Choi. Since the day she entered med school, she had been waiting for Professor Choi to return from Boston. During that time, she memorized all his papers because every single word was perfection. Professor Choi didn't say anything and returned the quiz. Seok looked at it and was overjoyed, even putting it on the ceiling to admire it repeatedly, as Professor Choi wrote "perfect" on it. That night, Seok braved the heavy rain and asked Professor Choi to teach her everything he knew. Professor Choi saw his younger self in this passionate girl. They both loved the brain and were crazy about it, willing to die in the operating room. Professor Choi knew Seok, like him, was a mad genius. After Seok rejected him, Professor Choi approached Dr. Han from anesthesiology. Dr. Han was Seok's partner in black market surgeries. Like Professor Choi, he admired Seok's skills and wanted everyone to see her talent. Professor Choi had promised that if Seok agreed to do surgery, he would talk to the medical board and get her license reinstated. Seok knew that even if she got her license back, she could only open a local clinic, which was worse than her current life. To sever ties with her past, Seok burned all her study materials that night, including the papers with Professor Choi's perfect comments. From the photo remnants, Youngju found a nurse who assisted Seok with surgeries and learned more about Seok's past. 7 years ago, Professor Choi needed to recommend a student to study in Boston. Everyone thought Seok would get the spot, but Professor Choi gave it to another student, Ha Woo-young. Seok was upset and questioned why he sent an idiot to Boston. She even insulted Ha Woo-young's mother for buying her spot. Professor Choi slapped Seok hard and banned her from any surgeries. A year later, when Professor Choi was away, the department head allowed Seok to perform a surgery. Just as the surgery was finishing, Professor Choi burst in and ordered Seok to stop. Seok refused, so Professor Choi had her pulled out. From that day on, their relationship was broken. Now, to survive, Professor Choi reached out to Seok, promising to get her a spot at Boston University where she could do any surgery she wanted. Seok said she hated him and even wished he would die soon. Ms. Na worried Seok might mess up the surgery on purpose, but Professor Choi knew Seok too well. She was too proud to make any mistakes. Youngju also tried to convince Seok to go to the US with him. But Seok was throwing a tantrum, saying her pharmacy and restaurant were here, and she wasn't going anywhere. Actually, the restaurant didn't belong to Seok, but she often ate there. Recently, the restaurant owner's younger brother, Kwon Sing-yu, had just been released from prison. He came every day to harass Seok, even watching her house. Recently, Kwon Sing-yu kept beating his elder sister for money. The owner had no choice but to sell the restaurant and give the money to Kwon Sing-yu. Seok was so angry, she wanted to kill Kwon Sing-yu right away. She'd been eating at this restaurant for 7 years and had strong feelings for it. 3 days later, Seok came to the restaurant and noticed Kwon Sing-yu had removed his ankle monitor. When she left, she purposely left her umbrella behind. Kwon Sing-yu took the opportunity to approach her and asked if she wanted to get drinks with him tomorrow. Seok pretended to agree, then went back to her pharmacy and made a special drink. Kwon Sing-yu, lost in the joy of love, drank it easily. The medicine didn't take effect right away. He even helped Seok carry a big roll of plastic wrap home. While resting, Seok kindly helped him take off his coat and gave him a towel. Kwon Sing-yu fell asleep without realizing it. When he woke up, he was lying on the plastic wrap he had brought in. Seok smiled wickedly and ended his life in an instant. Young-ju, who was studying, got Seok's call and immediately guessed Kwon Sing-yu's fate. He blamed Seok for being reckless, but rushed to her house to clean up the crime scene. Young-ju carefully scrubbed the floor and burned all of Kwon Sing-yu's things. A police car passed nearby and saw the flames outside Seok's house. Noticing the police approaching, Young-ju hid nervously in the house. Meanwhile, Seok was happily digging a hole on a remote mountain. Suddenly, a beam of light shone from a distance. Seok grabbed the shovel and hid behind a car. She was about to strike but saw that the person was her mentor, Professor Choi. Professor Choi wasn't scared, but suggested she dig the hole even deeper. He also worried that Seok might get caught for murder and advised her to start fresh in Boston. Seok was sure Professor Choi wouldn't report her, because she was the only one who could do surgery for him in all of Korea. Then, Ms. Na's voice called from afar, and Professor Choi's phone rang at the wrong time. He lied to Ms. Na, saying he got lost and saw Seok burying a dead dog. As Seok guessed, Professor Choi didn't cause Seok any trouble. The next morning, the police came to the restaurant to investigate the missing Kwon Sing-yu. They kindly warned Seok to be careful of that guy. Young-ju was very nervous while Seok acted as if nothing happened. She even happily said she could keep eating at the restaurant every day. At that moment, a colleague rushed in urgently. The Ministry of Health and Welfare ordered the pharmacy to shut down for 30 days for illegally selling prescription drugs. Dr. Han's clinic faced the same trouble. Seok knew her mentor was behind all of this, so she called to confront him. Professor Choi calmly invited her to Busan to discuss it. Seeing Seok struggling to breathe, Young-ju suggested she think of her calmest, happiest moments. Seok adjusted her breathing, and memories of Professor Choi teaching her in the operating room flooded her mind. To solve the pharmacy issue, Seok went to a hotel in Busan, where a medical award ceremony was about to take place. Professor Choi had won the Ichida Award for 9 consecutive years and was likely to win again. In the ladies' room, a few staff members discussed the main sponsor, Ms. Ichida, who always hid in her suite. Her son had a serious brain condition, but no doctor dared to perform the surgery. Seok overheard and came up with an idea. She thought that Professor Choi needed to be humiliated so he would come to his senses. After Young-ju fell asleep, Seok quietly left and broke into Ms. Ichida's room. She plugged in a USB stick and played a video of a black market surgery she had performed. The patient in the video, like Ms. Ichida's son, had hemophilia, which prevented blood from clotting. Such an extensive surgery was a risky gamble for any doctor, but Seok had saved the patient using her unique skills. She offered to operate on Ms. Ichida's son, but only if Ms. Ichida withdrew Professor Choi's award. Ms. Ichida immediately opened the door and asked Seok to leave. She didn't want to entrust her son's life to such a despicable doctor. However, deep down, she was still intrigued by Seok's offer. So Ms. Ichida asked Professor Choi about Seok's abilities. Professor Choi answered that Seok was perfect and had never failed. Ms. Ichida changed her mind and visited Seok, agreeing to the deal. That night, Seok and Young-ju headed to Japan. Dr. Han received the news and rushed to the airport as well. During the surgery, Seok was completely calm. Suddenly, an emergency occurred. All Japanese doctors yelled to stitch the patient up and send him to the ICU. But Seok remained focused and continued the surgery, ultimately creating a miracle. Afterwards, Ms. Ichida kept her promise and gave the award to another doctor, not the expected Professor Choi. Seok excitedly mumbled, "I won." But she didn't know that Professor Choi already knew about her entire plan. Ms. Ichida told Professor Choi what had happened and wasn't sure she could trust Seok. Professor Choi, knowing this was Seok's revenge, still vouched for her, hoping Ms. Ichida would give Seok a chance. On her way back, Seok met a man, Little Kim, who brought back memories. 7 years ago, Little Kim had brought his father to the hospital where Seok worked. Mr. Kim was diagnosed with a brain tumor and asked Professor Choi to perform surgery. Ha Woo-young revealed that Mr. Kim and Professor Choi were good friends, but Seok noticed Professor Choi seemed nervous and acted unnatural. What was even more suspicious was that Professor Choi had only assigned Ha Woo-young as his assistant for the surgery. The next day, Seok found an excuse to send Ha Woo-young away and replaced him in the operating room to assist her mentor. While handing him the scalpel, Seok deliberately cut Professor Choi's palm and took over the surgery. The surgery was successful, but Professor Choi wasn't happy. Seok explained that she didn't allow medical errors to appear on his record. She had already noticed that Professor Choi didn't see Mr. Kim as a friend, but rather hated him. Professor Choi was always tense because he planned to mess up the surgery and kill Mr. Kim. Seok made this judgment because she believed she and Professor Choi were the same, both evil and insane. Professor Choi didn't answer and left the office. Now Little Kim revealed that after the surgery, his father called, saying he wanted to live freely on his own. After that call, Little Kim never heard from his father again. Seok began to suspect her mentor. Professor Choi was notified that the police had found the scene of black market surgery. At this point, Seok met up with Professor Choi. She brought up Mr. Kim's disappearance and accused him of killing Mr. Kim. She also guessed the reason Professor Choi didn't send her to Boston was because she had saved the patient he wanted to kill. Professor Choi denied all and called her pathetic. He then took a taxi to the temple where Seok performed black market surgery. Inspector Yang, handling the case, was a friend from Professor Choi's hometown. He took Professor Choi to the back mountains, where they found the nurse's body. Seeing the marks on the victim's neck, Professor Choi was shocked. He knew immediately that this was Seok's doing. One weekday, Seok, who was usually obsessed with surgery, surprisingly took a day off. Worried, Professor Choi and Ha Woo-young went to Seok's house and saw that her face was injured. Seok lied, saying she slipped on ice on the way. Seeing this, Professor Choi sent Ha Woo-young away. He then told Seok that he could see straight through her and demanded that she tell the truth. Seok panicked and urged Ha Woo-young to return quickly and take Professor Choi away. When she returned to the living room, Professor Choi was gone. Seok rushed to the storage room, but Professor Choi had already found the body. The night before, an evil guy had tried to hurt Seok. To protect herself, Seok had stabbed him with a knife. Professor Choi asked if she could take care of it herself. Seok nodded in confusion, but soon realized her mentor shared her same madness. It was the warmest care she'd ever heard. The police carried out a large-scale search around the abandoned building. Seok returned to the crime scene, admiring her art with satisfaction. She noticed Professor Choi was also there, suspecting he was collaborating with the police to pressure her because he missed out on the Ichida Award. Professor Choi warned her to stop now, but Seok ignored him and brought up Mr. Kim again. She still believed Professor Choi had killed Mr. Kim and threatened to find his body. Soon, Little Kim found a lead. A mental hospital had been exposed for mistreating patients, with 40% of them being involuntary admissions. The hospital was now closed, and only a maintenance worker remained. He claimed to have seen Mr. Kim there. For a large reward, the worker swore that Mr. Kim was a patient at the hospital. He mentioned that Mr. Kim had a surgical scar on his head and that he had seen a gray-haired man visit him. Seok quickly found a photo of Professor Choi, but the worker couldn't remember what the visitor looked like. However, Mr. Kim had registered under a fake name, so they couldn't confirm if the worker was telling the truth. The worker contacted a former colleague, asking him to send a photo with the patients. But hours passed, and the former colleague hadn't sent the photos. The worker decided to swing by his place and pick up the photo the next morning, but Little Kim didn't want him to leave. In the argument, the worker's hand was cut by broken glass. Seok told Little Kim to step outside to calm down, and then bandaged the worker's wound. only to discover he was wearing Mr. Kim's ring. The greedy worker had stolen the ring while Mr. Kim was hospitalized. Seok warned him not to let little Kim see the ring, but little Kim overheard. He was furious and demanded the worker tell him where his father was. In the heavy rain, the two fought fiercely. Seok tried to stop them, but watched as they accidentally fell off a cliff. The worker died on the spot, and little Kim was left in critical condition in the ICU. Seok, holding a ring, stormed to Professor Choi's office, angrily accusing him of being a hypocrite. She believed that Professor Choi had kicked her out because he was embarrassed that she had caught him trying to murder a patient. Professor Choi ignored her repeated questions and left the office. He slammed on the gas, trying to vent the anger. After getting home, Professor Choi told the housekeeper to make some rice porridge and leave early. He then went to a secret cabin deep in the forest, where Mr. Kim's Rolls-Royce was hidden. Years ago, the two had gone on a trip together. Mr. Kim had touched something dirty and then used the wet wipe Professor Choi handed him. Now, Professor Choi used the same trick, handing the same type of wet wipe to Detective Lee. Recently, Detective Lee had found animal hair on the nurse's clothing. Later, following Professor Choi's instructions, Ms. Na approached the coroner and learned that the hair belonged to Rottweilers. In the car, Detective Lee asked about Seok. Since he had interacted with her, he knew she owned 3 Rottweilers. Based on the clues, Detective Lee suspected Seok was both the murderer and the doctor behind black market surgery. After saying this, he fell unconscious. Just as Seok had suspected, the true killer of Mr. Kim was indeed Professor Choi. After Mr. Kim made his phone call to his son, he fell into danger. Barely alive, he tried to escape, but accidentally fell off the cliff. Ms. Na had been tracking Professor Choi and discovered his secret, but instead of calling the police, she gave Mr. Kim emergency aid. Although Mr. Kim survived, he lost his memory due to a severe brain injury. Professor Choi had also visited him in the mental hospital. Eventually, Mr. Kim died shortly after being transferred to the nursing home. Professor Choi returned to the crime scene and threw Mr. Kim's ring off the cliff. Little Kim remained in a coma. When Seok visited the hospital, she happened to run into Professor Choi as he was about to leave. He reminded her that the police had found dog hair on the nurse's clothes. It was only a matter of time before she became a suspect. Meanwhile, Professor Choi's hands were getting slower by the day. They both had little time left. Even so, Seok refused to perform surgery on him, hoping they would never meet again. Due to the series of accidents, Seok's team hadn't had any surgeries lately. Seok was sinking deeper into despair. She even thought about escaping to prison, where she would be forced to do surgeries every day, only eating and sleeping after finishing them. To Seok, such a life would be heaven. Dr. Han mentioned that young Ju would undoubtedly follow her without hesitation. Seok first met young Ju at Dr. Han's clinic. Young Ju had a malignant brain tumor but refused to have surgery. Seok realized that the pain had stripped him of his will to live, so she promised him an easy death on the operating table. Since death was inevitable, young Ju agreed to the surgery. However, he was surprised to wake up to a new lease on life. From that day on, young Ju was loyal only to Seok. The next morning, Seok made a special glass of juice for young Ju, only to find he hadn't returned. She contacted him and learned that he was attending class. Later that afternoon, Seok went to pick him up after school, but still couldn't find him. Upon calling again, she found out he was at the movies with friends. Seok felt a bit let down, but didn't know that young Ju was kidnapped by the gang. The police had been investigating the nurse's death and discovered the involvement of a gang in the black market surgeries. The patient involved was the notorious gang boss who was on the run. His men had captured young Ju and interrogated him about the nurse's killer. To protect Seok, young Ju refused to reveal the truth, despite the threats. Seok waited at the theater exit, but young Ju never appeared. Soon she received a call and rushed to the gang's hideout. Although young Ju admitted to being the killer, the boss didn't believe him. After some conversation, the boss was convinced Seok was the real murderer. He threatened Seok to kill the broker, Min, to make sure he didn't say another word to the police. Seok agreed to his request and took the injured young Ju. On the way, Seok suggested they immigrate to the Philippines, but Young-ju refused. He didn't want Seok to change her life to protect him, angrily urging her to be more rational. Just then, several fire trucks passed by. They rushed home and found that the doghouse had caught fire. Seok watched helplessly as her beloved dog perished in the fire. After the fire was put out, Seok contacted Professor Choi, knowing he was behind the arson. She had no hesitation and repeatedly crashed into his car. Professor Choi walked to the back of the car and locked eyes with her. Seok, furious, slammed the gas pedal but ultimately missed him. This time, Professor Choi had won. Seok, overwhelmed with grief, broke down crying as she stared at the dog tags. The next day, an uninvited guest arrived. Min, the broker, had previously collaborated with Seok's team on black market surgery. When Seok realized it involved body parts trafficking, she messed up the operation, causing Min to lose millions won in fines. But he considered that money as Seok's debt. Though Seok didn't want to get involved in his filthy work again, she had no choice but to agree to one more surgery due to her debt. This surgery would take place on a cruise ship, and another surgeon would be joining as well. Just then, a car arrived. It was Professor Choi. Not long ago, Inspector Yang had found Min's secretary. He gotten Min's phone number and called him. Min immediately met with Professor Choi first, and they made a deal. Professor Choi agreed to join the surgery, while Min promised not to provide the police with any damaging information about Seok. Seok glared at Professor Choi, her heart filled with fury. Min explained that the patient specifically requested Professor Choi and that he would be the lead surgeon for this operation. Seok stood on the deck, sadly tossing the dog tags into the sea. Professor Choi walked up to her and admitted that he had started the fire, all to help clean up the aftermath for her. To him, it was just a few dogs. Seok, enraged, grabbed an umbrella and began to violently hit Professor Choi. Luckily, Young-ju and Dr. Han arrived just in time. Hearing that Professor Choi had been beaten, Min was furious and warned that if the surgery went wrong, no one would leave the ship. The patient was a cult leader with 200,000 followers. Before the surgery, Seok mentioned that Professor Choi had trouble with his hands and reminded Dr. Han to keep a close watch on him. Meanwhile, Professor Choi had injected himself with a stabilizer. The surgery was about to begin. Seok first introduced the entire procedure to the patient, then suggested Professor Choi switch positions if something happened. Professor Choi, stubborn as ever, refused her offer. However, during the surgery, his hands suddenly shook, but he quickly regained his composure. Then Professor Choi started chatting with Seok, pointing out that she was dangerously impulsive, completely selfish, and ungrateful. But he was grateful to her, because the time they spent working together was the most exciting and fulfilling moments of his life. Those words slowly melted the hatred in Seok's heart. After the surgery, Seok also admitted that the time she worked with Professor Choi at the hospital had been the happiest time of her life. Sadly, this would be their last surgery together. Seok sincerely said to Professor Choi, "Thank you for everything." The next day, Seok and Young-ju disembarked, but learned that Professor Choi had already left. Along the way, Professor Choi took out a letter from Seok applying to become a resident physician. Seok confessed that since childhood, her mind would never stop racing, like tiny explosions happening every moment, making it hard to eat or sleep. She believed there was a tiny worm crawling through her brain, poking around and making her think. That's why she had headaches. Interestingly, young Professor Choi had felt exactly the same way. It wasn't until he first entered the operating room and saw a live human brain that his mind finally stopped racing. Both Professor Choi and Seok were fascinated by the human brain, seeing it as a great piece of art. Min invited Seok and Young-ju to dinner and took them into the bustling street. In reality, to protect himself, Min had made a deal with Inspector Yang to turn in the doctors involved in black market surgery. Seok sensed something was off and sent Young-ju away before taking Min to a quiet place to talk. Just then, Ha Uyong called, warning Seok that Professor Choi's condition was critical and he didn't have much time left. While Seok was distracted, Min was dragged away by a mysterious man. She noticed bloodstains on the ground, and the side profile of the mysterious man looked remarkably like Professor Choi. Youngju noticed the police were nearby and quickly pulled Seok away. At that moment, Seok received an anonymous text message. Following the instructions, they arrived at a red lighthouse and found Min's car keys. Once they escaped to a safe place, Seok immediately contacted Ha Uyong to question the real condition of Professor Choi. It turned out that Professor Choi's MRI results were completely different from the ones Seok had seen. His condition was far worse than Seok had imagined, and even surgery couldn't cure it. Seok asked Dr. Han to find an operating room. She had already decided to perform surgery on Professor Choi. After reviewing Professor Choi's MRI scans, Dr. Han realized just how difficult the surgery would be. Soon after, little Kim passed away from his injuries. Professor Choi and Seok attended the funeral. Seok pressed him to explain why he had wanted to kill Mr. Kim. This time, Professor Choi told the truth. Years ago, Mr. Kim wanted to poach her to his hospital in the US, using her to make a lot of money. Many young doctors had broken down after working for him. Professor Choi was furious that this bastard wanted to steal his carefully trained student. It was raining outside, and both of them remembered about the past. Seok demanded to know why Professor Choi had distanced himself from her, abandoned her. Before he could answer, Seok spoke the answer herself. She saw through Professor Choi's attempt to murder Mr. Kim, which damaged his pride. But Seok was happy because she realized that her once exalted mentor was, deep down, just as crazy as she was. Even though Professor Choi had hurt her many times, she still didn't want him to die. To ensure the surgery went smoothly, Seok started watching related videos, and Dr. Han found an operating room at the clinic. However, as the surgery drew near, crises continued to arise. The police discovered Min's body in an alley. The coroner determined that the killer must master some medical knowledge based on the wounds. Surveillance footage only captured the killer's back. Inspector Yang remained silent because the killer he witnessed was Professor Choi. To confirm, Inspector Yang contacted Professor Choi for a meeting. He questioned Professor Choi about whether he killed Min and Detective Lee, and whether he was involved in black market surgeries. Professor Choi neither confirmed nor denied, because he also had information that could destroy Inspector Yang in an instant. If things came out, they'd both go down together. Soon, the technical team enhanced the surveillance footage. Inspector Yang clearly saw Seok in the video. During the interrogation, Seok remained extremely calm, falsely claiming she was just killing some time there. Inspector Yang presented evidence of Seok attempting to strangle Professor Choi in the hospital, believing Seok hated Professor Choi. However, all Seok could remember was Professor Choi's cheerful laughter on that rainy day. Normal people couldn't understand the bond between them. Inspector Yang then speculated that the person involved in the black market surgeries wasn't Professor Choi, but Seok. Professor Choi killed the broker just to protect Seok, because Seok was his weakness. Inspector Yang's analysis startled Seok. After the interrogation, Seok informed her mentor about the surgery scheduled for the next night. After Professor Choi agreed to everything, he quickly hung up the phone and began clearing out his office. Ms. Na revealed that Inspector Yang had interrogated Seok for 3 hours that morning, and she had a bad feeling about it. Professor Choi remembered Seok's weak voice and angrily cursed Inspector Yang as a bastard. On the day of the surgery, Seok finished her preparations, but found that Professor Choi hadn't arrived yet. Meanwhile, Inspector Yang received a call and went to the secret cabin in the forest. There, he opened the freezer and found Detective Lee. At that moment, Professor Choi appeared and played a recording. Detective Lee, before dying, revealed that Inspector Yang had accepted bribes in multiple cases and concealed the truth. This evidence could ruin Inspector Yang completely. Professor Choi admitted that he had worked with Min in black market surgeries and committed all the murders. He hoped Inspector Yang kept investigating and then catch him. Seok didn't wait for Professor Choi, but instead, a doctor named Alan arrived. Alan was specially brought in from the US by Professor Choi. He informed Seok of Professor Choi's real plan, to die on the operating table a month later. To prepare for this, Professor Choi had been taking special painkillers. These drugs had severe side effects, worsening his condition and reducing the anesthesia's effectiveness, making the surgery much harder. After learning about the insane plan, Seok rushed to find Professor Choi, but both his home and his office were completely cleared out. Alan explained that Professor Choi's intention was to make Seok experience a failure, so she could learn from it. So now he needed to break Seok down, realizing there were things surgeons couldn't do. Seok, feeling agitated, couldn't understand her mentor's thoughts. However, Alan remained optimistic about Seok, believing she could pull this off. He planned to assist Seok during the surgery and even suggested a seemingly feasible surgical approach. Without hesitation, Seok went to the gang boss for help, demanding he find Professor Choi. Ms. Na secretly sought Dr. Han's help to save the suffering Professor Choi. When Professor Choi regained consciousness, Dr. Han urged him to give up the surgery and accept death peacefully. He even promised to take care of Professor Choi until he passed. But Professor Choi remained stubborn, insisting on dying his own way. To him, both he and Seok were the best doctors. He was already terminally ill and had no chance of survival. But Seok was at her peak, and because she had never failed, she was overconfident. She needed to experience loss, pain, and even lose all her confidence as a doctor, unable to pick up the scalpel again, in order to surpass her limits. That was the final lesson Professor Choi wanted to teach her. The gangster boss, using his informants, found out where Professor Choi was. Professor Choi revealed his entire plan. To him, Seok still had a bright future while he was going to die, so he would take the fall for her. The gangster boss, persuaded by Professor Choi, chose to respect his decision. Young Ju learned from Ms. Na that Professor Choi had made a deal with Inspector Yang, agreeing to take the blame for all the charges. Young Ju suggested that Seok let Professor Choi protect her. Seok was filled with anger and frustration. She couldn't let her mentor die, nor could she let him become a scapegoat. That night, Seok met with Inspector Yang and learned about Professor Choi's real plan. A month later, Professor Choi would call Inspector Yang to arrest him, but by then, according to the plan, he would already be dead on the operating table. The police couldn't charge the deceased, and the case would be dropped out. Seok shouted loudly that Professor Choi wouldn't die because she would save him. She had even recorded their conversation. Inspector Yang panicked. To give his superiors a satisfactory result and protect his own secrets, he drove his car straight at Seok and even aimed to ruin her hands. After Youngju regained consciousness, he rushed out of the car to protect Seok, enduring continuous beating. Seok lost control, pulled out a knife, and stabbed Inspector Yang. Afterwards, she contacted Professor Choi, screaming for him to meet her alone. Professor Choi no longer avoided her and hurried to the scene. With a worried face, he asked if she could take care of this by herself. This time, Seok admitted that she needed her mentor's help. In an instant, Professor Choi smiled. Seok also smiled, but gradually, tears began to fall. She had no idea why her mentor did all this. Professor Choi confessed that he wanted to give her everything he knew and every skill he had. But now, Seok just wanted him to stay alive. If not, she would get even worse and kill anyone she wants. However, Professor Choi insisted that he must give her all before he died. But no matter how hard he tried, the only way he saw was to die on the operating table. Seok was determined to drag him to the surgery now. Professor Choi hit Seok with his cane and threatened that if she took another step towards him, she could forget about the surgery. Ignoring Seok's desperate pleas, he left her a phone and promised to call her within a month. In the midst of Seok's tears and screams, Professor Choi drove away in Inspector Yang's car. Soon after, at the perfect moment, Professor Choi called. When Seok saw her mentor again, her gaze was sharp, and she swore that she wouldn't fail. As the operating lights came on, Seok put on the surgical gown, and the surgery was about to begin. One day, Seok took on another black market surgery. This time, a fourth person would join their team. Seok looked at the new member, her eyes filled with excitement.